Good morning and welcome to Manchester Festival of Nature. We are opening a moth trap in an urban garden for you this afternoon. So we're from BC, Butterfly Conservation, and we are a UK charity dedicated to the conservation of butterflies and moths and the environment. So in the UK there are around 2,500 species of moths. 900 of those are macro moths and the rest are micro moths. Moths are important because they play many ecological roles. They're an important part of the food chain and they are important pollinators. There are lots of different methods of recording moths. One of them is using light traps, and there are various different light traps. This one is a Robinson and it uses a mercury vapour bulb, but you can get smaller traps that use different types of bulbs, but the key thing is that they use ultraviolet light. Other methods include searching during the day for daytime flying species and sugaring. So we're about to open the trap, and the catch in here is probably going to be typical of an urban garden in early summer, and using the light trap is a great way of seeing species that you may not see during the day, as well the majority of moths do fly at night. So I'm about to open the trap. So it's always useful to look on the collar of the trap, and already we have a small dusty wave, which is a carpet moth. They're quite commonly confused with folks. Around here we have a micro moth. So this is Califa lacunana, and that's quite a generalist species and quite common. They can be found during the day, disturbed from low-lying vegetation, and they're quite common and a regular feature of traps. We have another species here. So this is a migratory species. This is the diamondback moth, and they migrate from the continent, from Spain, and the larvae feed on brassicas, either cultivated or wild species. So inside the moth trap, so the moths get drawn in. Inside there are egg boxes, and these provide a place for moths to hide and feel safe. And as you can see, quite a lot of the egg boxes occupied by different species. So on this side we have a lot of heart and darts, which are these ones. And a diagnostic feature of the heart and dart is the black headband on the front of the head, and then the two darts and the hearts. And they're probably one of the commonest moth species during early summer, and they're generally quite uniform in colour. There's very little variation. Another micro moth species is this one here. This is another very common species associated with gardens. The larvae feed on the roots of dandelion species, of which there are about 300 in the UK. So they've got a lot of food plant to choose from, and they're a regular species throughout the summer in gardens. We have bright line brown eye. So it gets its name from the bright line at the end of the forewing, and the bright eye, which is the kidney mark there. And again, that varies very little. Another common garden species, which is the fanfoot. You look from the side on, these amazing structures called palps, and they come up from the front of the mouth parts really. There are a lot of moths that use camouflage or mimicry to protect themselves during the day, and one of those that does that is the buff tip. So this guy is a mimic of a broken twig. You can see the tip at the end and at the end of the forewing, and you can see, if you use a broken twig as an example, how similar that looks, and to a predator it may dismiss that for something inedible. And buff tip isn't the only species that uses this sort of mimicry. There are a couple of other species. So one of those is the flame, and that too looks like a broken twig, and it rolls its wings up very tightly, and again looks like a little bit of a broken stick. And this is just a great way for moths to avoid predation. One of the most ubiquitous garden moth species is the large yellow underwing. These are resident throughout the whole of the UK and also arrive as migratory species, and they bolster the numbers of the residents. They use a different type of protection, and they use a startle mechanism. They flash the yellow hindwing if disturbed by a predator. Another species with amazingly long palps, the snout. This is in the carpet moth group, and they're quite commonly found around hedgerows. Fly from sort of dusk onwards, generally quite early in the night. We've got lots of heart and darts. So we've got one in the trap here, a micro. So this is brown house moth, and you do frequently get them indoors, sheds, outbuildings, but they'll also use birds' nests and things like this. I think the larvae just feed on any old detritus, animal furs and that sort of thing. They're not too fussy. The brown house moth doesn't eat clothes. There are only two common clothes-eating species in the UK, and they generally prefer natural materials and will also utilise birds' nests and such. So there's nothing to worry about. If you see these species in your home, they're not of concern. So there's a couple of nice species here. The first is poplar grey, and this can be quite common in and around urban areas, especially as their larvae feed on poplars, and they're quite a common tree to plant in new developments because they're fast growing, they make good windbreaks, and so these guys can be quite common. They have a single generation in summer and fly for a very short period. So that's a quite nice one. Another is angle shades. So they're really great species. Their wings are almost crumpled up like dried leaf. So these guys will hibernate over winter. So they'll emerge in autumn, they'll hibernate over winter, sometimes coming out on mild nights during the winter. and then they reappear in spring, they'll mate and then pupate. It's also a migratory species, so again you get an influx during summer, and the larvae feed on pretty much anything. That's quite a nice one. There's nothing else that looks like the angleshades, which is always helpful. Smoky wainscot. So the wainscots are, it's this pale one here, this very straw coloured one. They generally feed on grasses associated with damp habitats, and it's quite common to, for people to have ponds in their gardens and grow the larval food plants inadvertently, and they're also associated with ditches and dikes. There's quite a few similar looking species, so it's always worth looking for the key features of these. So a couple of other species that are associated with grass are the grass moths, and they're micros. These little ones. This is Chrysatutia colmella. It's a very common species found in meadows, gardens. You can disturb them by day, but again there are also about 20 other species that look very similar, so it's worth just looking at them a little bit more closely. But this is one of the commoner ones and one of the earlier grass moths. So because there are so many species in the UK, you generally get a lot that look very similar to each other, and this is one of them. So this is double square spot, and its almost identical twin is the triple square spot, just to confuse you. But in urban areas you would expect to find double square spot more. There's very little to distinguish the two, and it's really generally down to experience. So one of those moths with the funny names is Cetaceous Hebrew Character. Don't actually know why it's called that, but it always makes me think, I don't know, it seems suspicious or something. But I think the markings are to do with the Hebrew. So the lights not only attract moths, but they bring in lots of other invertebrates too. And quite commonly you get beetles. Beetles are the most species-rich group in the UK. And in the trap we have a diving beetle. Which species it is, I'm not sure. But these are, some people record them as bycatch, but you get a lot of fly species. Quite commonly you get a lot of caddisflies. So it's not just the moths that can be of interest when opening the moth trap. So take the collar off and we'll start, now we've looked at all the apoxes, we'll just have a look at what's hiding around the side. So we have, these are a really nice example of showing that not all moths are brown and boring. So they've got a couple of light emerald, and these are a lovely almost jade green, and if you can see the detail, they've got a blood red tip to the forewing just here, and I don't think there are any other species that you could mistake it for. Another fairly bright species, and that's common at this time of year, is the buff ermine. So these guys, lovely yellow colour, and are identified by the row of spots. There is a similar species called white ermine, but the spots are generally, so the moth is white and the spots are generally all over the forewing. Moth that they're generally quite common in the garden is the willow beauty, and there are a number of confusion species, so it's definitely worth double checking that you haven't missed something that's slightly rarer or less common. Most commonly is misidentified as mottled beauty, and that it can be difficult to identify, as there is a lot of variation in the foreground colour and intensity of the markings. So you might be wondering why we would want to record the moths in our gardens, and a lot of the time it's just purely to get pleasure from seeing such a wide range of species that you wouldn't normally see during the day or anywhere else. And that's good for most people, but a lot of people record the species and make lists. So here we've listed species and we've kept tally of the number of species, number of individuals of each species as we've gone through the trap. Some of the important information that we need to collect is the date and what type of trap you've used, where you've trapped, along with a grid reference. Now, when you record moths, you always record them from the night before, because they generally fly in the earlier part of the night, so you wouldn't record them from the day that you were emptying the trap. This information is then entered onto the national database, which can be done either through the National Moth Recording Scheme that's run by Butterfly Conservation, or other methods that county moth recorders prefer, such as spreadsheets or MapMate. And I think there are other wildlife recording methods, but they're the most common. This data, once verified, then contributes to our understanding of insect declines and helps us highlight where those problems are, and it also shows us some of the positives as well about species that are spreading north and doing particularly well. So it's not all negative and it's not all about declines. There are a lot of positives, but without collecting this information and without the public recording these species, we wouldn't know things like that, and that's why it's so important. I know sometimes it's good enough to just admire them, but this just takes it up to another level.